Hey there, future despots and minnows of morality. Ever wondered what makes a truly horrific leader? Well, get ready, because we're diving into the diabolical depths of history's playbook on tyranny. From ancient Rome's most unhinged emperor to the Cold War's chilliest dictator, we're unearthing the sordid secrets and outlandish oddities of those who ruled with an iron fist, and sometimes a rubber chicken. Join me as we explore how these infamous figures turned their countries into personal sandboxes of sorrow, and discover why your worst day at the office probably wasn't that bad. Caligula. Imagine you're an ancient Roman citizen, just minding your business, tending to your grapes or whatever, when suddenly you hear that the new emperor has been announced. Great, you think. Hopefully this one won't be as bad as the last. Enter Caligula. Initially, hope was high with this young, somewhat handsome chap taking the throne. But it wasn't long before Rome realized that they didn't just get a new emperor. They got a deluxe, unchecked package of bizarre. Caligula's rule kicked off like any feel-good story, with promises of political reforms and public games. But the honeymoon phase fizzled out faster than you can say, "Wait, did he just appoint his horse as a priest?" Yes, my friends. Incitatus wasn't just any stallion. This lucky horse allegedly had a house, servants, and a seat in the Senate waiting under his tail. Talk about animal rights. But Caligula's quirks didn't stop at equine elevation. The man threw parties that would make modern frat houses look like tea parties. Imagine lavish feasts where guests were treated to watch their host argue with the moon. Yes, the actual moon. Caligula claimed it mocked him, which honestly, given his decisions, the moon might have had a point. Now, what's a tale of tyranny without a little divine delusion? Caligula didn't just think he was close to the gods, he was pretty convinced he was one. He had the heads removed from various statues of gods and replaced with his own, essentially turning divine worship into a selfie session. Financially, Rome was bleeding money faster than Caligula could throw it into the sea. Literally. He built a 2-mile floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae just to ride his horse across it, wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, to prove a point to, well, no one really knows. Maybe the sea gods needed a laugh. As for governance, let's just say you didn't want to be his advisor. One minute you're helping with legislative reforms, the next, you're tied to a wild beast in the arena because you looked at him funny. Political stability wasn't really his forte. In the grand spectrum of bad leadership, Caligula redefined the baseline. His reign was a spectacular flameout, a mixture of excessive spending, erratic behavior, and sheer cruelty. It's no surprise that his tenure ended as dramatically as it lived, assassinated by his own guards, a mere 4 years after it began. Turns out, making your horse a senator doesn't get you the stable government you'd hope for. Ivan the Terrible. Welcome to 16th century Russia, a land of harsh winters, expansive territories, and a ruler whose nickname isn't just for show. Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, took the throne at the tender age of 16 in 1547 and reigned until his death in 1584. But don't let his young start fool you. Ivan wasn't your typical teenage monarch. He was set to transform Russia, for better or for worse. Ivan's early days as Tsar started with reforms that actually had some promise. He called the very first meeting of the Zemsky Sobor, a kind of national assembly, which was pretty progressive for its time. He even attempted to establish a standing army known as the Streltsy. Things were looking up, right? Well, not for long. Around the 1560s, after a series of personal tragedies, including the death of his beloved wife Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan's rule took a dark turn. The man who once tried to stabilize a vast and unruly kingdom now unleashed an era of terror that would stain his name in history. He formed the Oprichnina, a state policy that divided the kingdom and granted him absolute power over a special territory, policed by his own personal guard. These guards, known as oprichniki, were loyal only to Ivan and became his tool for unleashing waves of mass repressions, public executions, and purges against the nobility whom he suspected of disloyalty. One of the most chilling examples of Ivan's cruelty was the Novgorod massacre in 1570. Paranoid about the city's allegiance, Ivan led his oprichniki in a campaign of slaughter against the residents of Novgorod. Historical records vary, but it's estimated that tens of thousands were killed, with some accounts claiming numbers as high as 60,000. The river running through Novgorod was said to have been choked with the bodies of the dead. Ivan's foreign policy was equally aggressive. He waged war against the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, expanding Russia's borders, but at a brutal cost. His campaign into the Baltic to control trade routes led to the prolonged and devastating Livonian War, which stretched the state's resources thin and ultimately proved unsuccessful. Domestically, Ivan's rule was marked by suspicion and fear. His paranoia was so intense that it extended to his own family. In a fit of rage, he killed his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, by striking him with a pointed staff during an argument in 1581. This act of parricide left Russia without a competent heir, foreshadowing the time of troubles after Ivan's death. His death in 1584 left behind a kingdom that was at once larger and yet profoundly destabilized by his terror-filled reign. Genghis Khan. Strap in as we gallop across the vast steppes of the 12th and 13th centuries with none other than Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire and a man whose name is practically synonymous with conquest. Born around 1162 as Temujin, he didn't exactly have a cushy start. With no fancy titles or lands handed to him, he had to claw his way up from poverty after his father was poisoned by rival Tatars. By 1206, Temujin had unified the Mongol tribes under his rule and earned the title Genghis Khan, which roughly translates to universal ruler. And Genghis wasn't about to let that title go to waste. He set his sights on expanding his domain, and let's just say he wasn't subtle about it. His strategy? Well, it was simple. Overwhelming force and absolute terror. He would offer cities a chance to surrender. If they refused, he'd unleash his army and not just defeat them, but demolish them so thoroughly that, as legend has it, even the dogs and cats were cut down. A bit overkill? Sure. Effective? Absolutely. It's said that his campaigns significantly reduced the global population at the time, which is an achievement, albeit a grim one. Genghis Khan's military tactics were revolutionary. His horsemen could shoot a bird in flight, talk about moving targets, and they were masters of the feigned retreat, basically the ancient equivalent of run away, just kidding, charge. This tactic confused and decimated enemy forces, a classic Mongol mix of brains and brutality. Under his rule, which stretched until his death in 1227, the Mongol Empire expanded to cover much of Asia and reached as far west as Eastern Europe. His campaigns across the steppes were so effective that he managed to create the largest contiguous land empire in history. And how's this for a logistics nightmare? His empire was so big that messages could take weeks to travel from one end to the other, even with a relay system of horse riders. Imagine texting someone and getting a reply next month. Wait, some of you do that? Genghis wasn't all about war, though. He introduced some surprisingly progressive policies for his time, such as religious tolerance and meritocracy. Yes, you could believe in whatever deity you wanted, as long as you also believed Genghis Khan was your supreme ruler. And he promoted people based on skills and loyalty over aristocratic birth, sort of like corporate promotions, but with less backstabbing and more actual stabbing. When Genghis Khan died in 1227 under mysterious circumstances, because even death couldn't be straightforward with him, the empire didn't just survive. It thrived under his successors who continued his legacy of conquest and expansion. Joseph Stalin. Next stop, the Soviet Union, mid-20th century, a place where the weather isn't the only thing that's cold. Joseph Stalin, the man whose last name means steel, took the reins of power after the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, and boy, did he hold those reins tightly. Under his rule, which stretched until his death in 1953, Stalin transformed the Soviet Union from a peasant society into an industrial and military superpower. But, as with most things Stalin, this came at a horrific cost. Born in 1878 in Georgia, not the peach state, but the one with more mountains and less sweet tea, Stalin was originally named Ioseb Vissarionis Dzhugashvili. Try saying that 3 times fast. He rose through the ranks of the Bolsheviks, showing a particular flair for the darker arts of political maneuvering. By the time he was in charge, Stalin was ready to make some omelets by breaking tens of millions of eggs. Stalin's policies were as subtle as a sledgehammer. The 5-year plans aimed to boost Soviet industry, but led to widespread famine, most infamously the Holodomor in Ukraine from 1932 to 1933, where millions starved. Then there was the Great Purge of the late 1930s, where Stalin's paranoia reached peak performance. But let's not forget Stalin's role in World War II. When Hitler decided to break his pact with Stalin and invade the Soviet Union in 1941, it was game on. The war was brutal, but under Stalin's ruthless command, the Soviet Red Army managed to turn the tide, capturing Berlin in 1945. Sure, Stalin was an ally during the war, but he was the kind of ally you keep an eye on at all times. Post-war, Stalin was as charming as ever, setting up puppet governments in Eastern Europe and helping kick off the Cold War. He continued his internal policies of repression and control, maintaining a tight grip until his death in 1953. Adolf Hitler. Hold on to your history books, kids, because we're about to dissect the life of a man whose very name is synonymous with evil, Adolf Hitler. His time in power, from 1933 to 1945, left a mark so indelible, it's practically a stain on the fabric of the 20th century. Born in Austria in 1889, little Adolf wasn't exactly voted most likely to dictate in school. Initially aspiring to be an artist, Hitler moved to Munich in 1913, but his painting career was about as successful as a chocolate teapot. After World War I, where he served with some distinction, he joined the German Workers' Party. By 1921, he was in charge, transforming it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short. The early 1930s were a chaotic time for Germany, with economic depression, massive unemployment, and social unrest. Like a shark smelling blood in the water, Hitler capitalized on this turmoil to climb the political ladder. In 1933, he was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and it didn't take long for him to seize absolute power. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 was a turning point, leading to the Reichstag fire decree, which diminished many civil liberties and paved the way for the arrest of Hitler's political adversaries. With Germany firmly in his grasp, Hitler's ambitions grew larger. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of their citizenship, and Kristallnacht in 1938 violently showcased the regime's anti-Semitic policies. But this was just the warm-up act. World War II kicked off in 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, a move as subtle as a sledgehammer to the face and just as gentle. Hitler's strategy during the war involved blitzkrieg tactics, fast, forceful, and ferocious, like a rabid wolverine in a small tent. This initially successful military strategy allowed Germany to sweep through much of Europe. However, the tide turned with failed invasions of Britain and the Soviet Union, and by 1945, the Third Reich was on its knees. During the war, Hitler also orchestrated the Holocaust, an attempt to exterminate the entire Jewish population of Europe, among other groups he considered undesirable. The sheer scale of this atrocity, 6 million Jews murdered, along with Romani people, disabled individuals, Poles, Soviet POWs, and others, makes it one of the darkest chapters in human history. As the Allies closed in, Hitler's world crumbled. On April 30th, 1945, with Berlin surrounded and his bunker under siege, Hitler chose suicide over surrender. His death marked the end of the war in Europe, but the scars of his brutal regime are still felt today. Mao Zedong. All right, time to turn our gaze to the East, where Mao Zedong, China's revolutionary father, took the art of leadership and added his own chaotic brushstrokes. Born in 1893 in Hunan province, Mao wasn't just a man with a plan. He had several, and most of them led to some pretty disastrous results. Mao's rise began within the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, which he helped found in 1921. He had a knack for guerrilla warfare, a useful skill that helped him climb to the top of the party. When the CCP finally seized power in 1949 after defeating the nationalists, Mao declared the founding of the People's Republic of China from atop Beijing's Tiananmen Gate. The country, however, was in ruins from years of war and colonial oppression. Mao's solution? Launch some ambitious and ultimately catastrophic campaigns to transform China into a socialist paradise. Enter the Great Leap Forward in 1958, Mao's attempt to catapult China into industrial and agricultural success. Spoiler alert, it didn't. This campaign involved massive collectivization of agriculture and a push for rapid industrialization, with peasants melting down their tools, and sometimes their cooking pots, to meet steel production quotas. The result wasn't the industrial marvel Mao had hoped for, but rather widespread famine and economic disaster. From 1959 to 1962, tens of millions of Chinese citizens died from starvation. Not one to let failure dampen his spirits, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966. This was his way of reasserting control and purging the Communist Party of what he saw as bourgeois elements threatening his vision. It turned out to be less of a revolution and more of a decade-long national nightmare. Schools were closed, intellectuals were persecuted, and youth groups known as Red Guards were unleashed to wreak havoc across the nation, all in the name of maintaining a pure communist ideology. Mao's governance led to an isolated China, suspicious of both the Soviet Union and the West. Yet his diplomatic maneuvers in the 1970s, like the visit from US President Richard Nixon, hinted at a possible thaw in Cold War tensions. When Mao died in 1976, his legacy was as complex as his life. He left behind a nation that had transformed from a colonial battleground to a communist powerhouse, but at the cost of millions of lives and widespread suffering. Pol Pot. Get ready for a chapter that's darker than a black hole at midnight. We're traveling to Cambodia in the mid-20th century, where Pol Pot, a name that sounds like a kitchen utensil but is far more sinister, led one of the most brutal regimes in history. Born in 1925 as Saloth Sar, Pol Pot was educated in some of the finest institutions in Paris, where he developed a taste not just for croissants, but for hardcore Marxist ideologies. Returning to Cambodia, he rose to power as the leader of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, better known as the Khmer Rouge. His goal? To transform Cambodia into a communist agrarian utopia, which sounds nice on paper but turned out about as well as a screen door on a submarine. In 1975, after years of civil war, Pol Pot's forces captured Phnom Penh and declared the beginning of Year Zero. It was like hitting the reset button on Cambodian society, but instead of fixing bugs, it introduced a whole host of catastrophic new ones. The entire population of cities was forcibly evacuated to the countryside to work in collective farms and labor projects. The idea was to purify society from capitalist influences and forge a new revolutionary culture based solely on agrarian socialism. This radical transformation included abolishing money, free markets, and private property. The regime's policies quickly led to widespread famine, forced labor, and mass executions. The Khmer Rouge targeted nearly everyone: intellectuals, former government officials, Buddhists, Muslims, ethnic Vietnamese, ethnic Chinese, and anyone suspected of connections with foreign governments or who had education that could pose a threat to Pol Pot's vision. Even wearing glasses could mark you as an intellectual and seal your fate. From 1975 to 1979, it's estimated that up to 2 million people died due to the combined effects of forced labor, malnutrition, poor medical care, and execution. This period spawned the term killing fields, after the discovery of mass graves containing thousands of bodies. The S-21 prison, or Tuol Sleng, a former high school-turned torture and execution center, remains a chilling testament to the horrors of Pol Pot's rule, where only a handful of prisoners survived out of the estimated 17,000 who were imprisoned there. Despite his disastrous policies, Pol Pot remained largely unchallenged until Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1979, toppling his regime and ending the nightmare of the Khmer Rouge's rule. Pol Pot retreated into the jungle, where he continued to lead the Khmer Rouge in a guerrilla war against the new Vietnamese-backed Cambodian government. He lived in relative obscurity until his death in 1998, never facing international justice for his crimes. Kim Jong Il. Now, let's take a surreal sojourn to North Korea, a land known for its secrecy and the cult of personality surrounding its leaders. Enter Kim Jong Il, the supreme leader who ruled with an iron fist and a passion for film. Born in 1941, or 1942, depending on which biography you trust, Kim Jong Il's rise to power was as scripted as one of his beloved movies. Kim Jong Il, affectionately known in state propaganda as the Dear Leader, took the reins of North Korea after the death of his father, Kim Il-sung. the country's founding father, in 1994. Kim Jong Il's reign was marked by his fervent pursuit of nuclear weapons, a love of luxury goods, and an extraordinary interest in cinema. He was rumored to own upwards of 20,000 videotapes and DVDs, including every Oscar winner for Best Picture. Talk about a movie marathon! Under his leadership, North Korea remained one of the most isolated and militarized countries in the world. The government's policies prioritized military spending and the development of its nuclear program over the welfare of its population, leading to widespread famine in the 1990s. This period, known as the Arduous March, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of North Koreans due to starvation and malnutrition. Meanwhile, the dear leader dined on lobsters and cognac, a stark contrast to the hardships faced by his people. Kim's obsession with film wasn't just a hobby, it influenced his government's propaganda machine. He famously ordered the kidnapping of a South Korean film director and his actress wife in the late 1970s to build a North Korean film industry that could compete on the world stage. The couple was forced to make films until their dramatic escape in the mid-1980s. Kim Jong-il's rule exemplified the bizarre blend of extreme repression and cult personality that has characterized North Korean leadership. His legacy of nuclear brinkmanship and economic mismanagement has had lasting effects on the Korean peninsula and beyond.